The city is painted in red, roses blooming on every street, candlelit dinners flickering through restaurant windows, lovers lost in whispered confessions. Valentine's Day, the night of passion, devotion, and secrets. But not all love stories end in a kiss. Some end in shadows. Some end in blood. Tonight, in a forgotten corner of the city, one desperate man walks a path he can never turn back from. Driven by ambition, haunted by choices, and pursued by something far darker than regret, Alex Tran is about to discover that love and death are not so different after all. Welcome to Iris-05 Story. If you crave the thrill of the unknown, the whispers of the haunted, and the pulse of a story you can't escape, subscribe now. Your next nightmare begins here. Crimson Valentine. Dare to listen? The night was heavy with the chill of early February. The streets of the small town bathed in the dim, yellow glow of streetlights. Alex Tran walked down the cracked sidewalks of his neighborhood, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, his head lowered as if he was trying to hide from the world. The city around him seemed to pulse with an uncomfortable stillness, broken only by the occasional car rumbling by or the sound of a distant dog barking. But to Alex, the quiet felt oppressive. With every step, the weight of his life pressed down harder. His dead-end job, the crushing bills that piled up faster than he could make enough to pay them, and the constant nagging feeling that he was just another forgotten face in a place full of dreams that had died long before they even had a chance to live. Beside him, his friends Mike, John, and Lisa walked in silence. It wasn't the comfortable kind of silence that came from knowing each other for years. It was the kind that hung like a cloud, thick and suffocating. Mike kicked a small rock on the sidewalk, his thoughts clearly elsewhere, his mind on his family, as always. John, on the other hand, wore a half-smile, his eyes scanning the streets with a restlessness that matched Alex's own. Lisa, Alex's girlfriend, walked a step behind him, her fingers clutching a small, neatly wrapped gift in her hand. "Hey, Alex." Lisa's voice broke the silence, soft but tentative. She stepped closer, her eyes searching his face. I wanted to give you something. It's for Valentine's Day." Alex turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. Without a word, he took the small gift, unwrapping it slowly. Inside was a handmade bracelet, simple, but filled with care and love. "It's nothing much," Lisa added, her voice thick with uncertainty. "Just something to remind you that you got it." Alex forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. His mind wasn't on the gift. It wasn't on the love she had poured into something so simple. No. His mind was elsewhere, already lost in the dangerous thrill of the plan he had been nurturing for weeks. "Thanks," he said, his voice flat. "It's great." Lisa's smile faltered, but she didn't push. She knew something was off, knew that the man she loved had drifted far from her, swallowed by the darkness of his ambition. As they continued walking, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that Valentine's Day wasn't about love for him. It was about the perfect opportunity, a chance to prove something to the world, a chance to finally break free from the poverty that chained him. The plan, the heist, it was all too perfect. A quick score. The jewelry store, rich with opulence and promise, was the key to everything he had ever wanted. "I'm telling you, this is our shot," Alex said, his voice rising with excitement, though it wasn't aimed at anyone in particular. His mind was already rehearsing the details of the night to come, thinking of what it would feel like to step into that world of wealth and power. "It's the perfect night. Valentine's. The place will be packed with customers, distracted, thinking of nothing but love. They won't see us coming." Mike looked at him, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "I don't know, man," he said slowly, his voice edged with concern. "This is dangerous. It's one thing to talk about it, but another to actually—" "Mike," Alex interrupted, his tone sharp. "You want to stay here, stuck in this life? Do you want to keep pretending like this is all there is?" Mike opened his mouth to respond but closed it again, realizing it wasn't worth it. His mind was already made up, his loyalty to Alex, keeping him here despite his better judgment. John grinned, his expression wild with the kind of recklessness that came from being bored with life. "Hell yeah, let's do it. I'm in. Who wouldn't want to be rich by next week?" Lisa, who had been listening quietly, felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She had heard whispers of Alex's plan, but she had hoped it was just talk. Hoped that the man she loved would find another way out of the mess they were in. But now, hearing the cold certainty in his voice, she knew. She couldn't just stand by and watch him throw everything away. Underscore 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 underscore. This version adds depth to Alex's character, capturing his emotional turmoil and his desire for something more, while also showing Lisa's concern and the tension within the group. The tone aims to draw listeners in, creating an atmosphere that builds up to the darker decisions that will follow. This should help maintain the flow for the rest of the chapters, ensuring that each emotional shift feels grounded and consequential. The night felt thick with tension as Alex paced around his small, dimly lit apartment, his thoughts spinning. The promise of Valentine's Day was approaching, but for Alex, it wasn't about romance. It wasn't about love. It was about freedom. He turned to Mike and John, sitting across from him at the small kitchen table, the air between them heavy with anticipation. "We do this tonight, and our lives change forever," Alex said, his voice a mix of excitement and danger. "I've planned everything down to the last detail. All we have to do is walk in, take what we need, and walk out. Simple." Mike shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He wasn't the type to take risks, especially when it came to something that could change the course of his family's life. The uncertainty hung in his eyes. "I'm not sure about this, Alex," Mike muttered, his voice tinged with worry. "You know what this could mean, right? For my family, for me?" Alex locked eyes with him, his tone sharpening. "Mike, what else is there? You want to keep living like this forever? You want to keep struggling? This is our chance to get out, to have something better." John, ever the thrill-seeker, leaned forward with a grin.
"Come on, Mike.
"We all know this is the only way out. Don't tell me you're scared now. Think of what we could have. Money, freedom, no more pretending." Mike's eyes flickered between Alex and John. His hesitation was clear, but the weight of his family's needs, the pressure that gnawed at him every day, pulled him closer to the edge. After a long silence, Mike finally nodded, albeit reluctantly.
"All right.
But this is the last time, Alex. After this, I'm done." Alex gave a tight smile, his pulse quickening. "You won't regret it. This is our ticket to a new life. You'll see." Lisa, who had been waiting outside the door, overheard the last part of their conversation. Her heart sank as she stood frozen in place, her hand on the doorknob. She felt the cold seep into her bones, the realization hitting her like a slap to the face. Alex was going through with it. The man she loved, the man she thought she knew, was going to make a choice that could destroy everything. She had meant to eavesdrop, but the words tore through her, leaving her speechless. Her mind raced. She had to stop him. She had to make him see reason. But how? As Alex finished speaking, his gaze lifted, and he saw her standing there, eyes wide with shock. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. "Lisa," he said, his voice suddenly tight, his tone dropping. "You shouldn't have heard that." Her heart pounded in her chest, the weight of his words crashing over her. "You're really going to do this, aren't you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Alex, please, this isn't the way. You don't have to do this. There's still time to turn back." Alex's jaw clenched. "It's too late for that, Lisa. You don't understand. This is the only way I can get out of here. We can finally be happy. You and me together." Lisa took a step forward, her eyes filled with desperation. "You think money will make you happy? You think hurting people will fix this? Alex, I love you, but I can't stand by and watch you throw everything away for a chance at something that'll never be enough." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. For a moment, Alex's resolve wavered. He looked at her, his heart torn between the love he felt for her and the promise of something more, something that would erase the pain of his life up until now. But in the end, the allure of power, of finally being in control, pushed everything else aside. "I have to do this," Alex said, his voice firm. "I'm not asking you to understand, Lisa, but this is happening." Lisa's face crumpled with pain, but she didn't back down. "Then I'll stop you. I'll make sure you don't go through with it." But Alex just shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "You can try, but nothing's going to stop me now." As Lisa turned and walked away, her heart breaking with each step, Alex's mind was already racing. He was committed now. There was no turning back. The plan was in motion, and nothing could derail it. Outside, the cold wind whipped through the streets, but inside, the tension was even colder. The dark plan had taken root, and there was no escaping its consequences. The cold February air wrapped around Alex like a suffocating blanket. He stood in his dimly lit apartment, the weight of the world pressing down on his chest. The walls felt closer tonight, tighter, almost as if they were closing in on him. His mind buzzed with the thought of the heist, the one thing that would free him from this life. But then there was Lisa. Her face, full of hope, had haunted him ever since their last conversation. She begged him to walk away. "Please, Alex, don't do this," she had said, her voice trembling with fear. But he couldn't. The plan was set. There was no turning back now. No second chances. It was his only way out. He had promised her, though. He'd told her, with more conviction than he had ever felt, that he would abandon the plan. But the truth was, Alex's resolve had always been thin. A promise made in the heat of the moment was just that. Temporary. Alex moved to the small table in the corner, where Mike and John were already preparing. Maps of the jewelry store were spread out, each route marked with precision. His hands hovered over the plan, but his thoughts were elsewhere, on Lisa. He knew she had to be feeling betrayed. She must have been so full of fear, wondering whether the man she loved still existed, or if he was already gone. There was a knock on the door, a sound that sliced through the thick silence of the room. Mike's voice broke through his thoughts. "You ready, man?" Alex nodded, though his stomach churned. This was it.
But something was different this time.
As he stood to open the door, a flood of guilt washed over him. He had lied, not just to Lisa, but to himself. He was trapped, cornered by his own ambition, by his desire to escape the weight of this life. As Alex turned the knob, the door creaked open, revealing Mike, his face drawn, his eyes filled with uncertainty. John stood behind him, a grin plastered on his face, eager for the thrill of the heist. But to Alex, John's grin only looked hollow now. "Everything's set. We're good to go," Mike said, his voice laced with apprehension. Alex forced a smile, but it was hollow.
"Yeah,
let's do this." Before they could leave, a quiet sound from the corner of the room made Alex freeze. It was the softest whisper, almost too faint to hear. But it was there. The sound of Lisa's voice. "Alex." Alex spun around, his heart hammering in his chest. There, standing in the doorway, was Lisa. She looked pale, her eyes red from crying. Her body shook slightly as she stepped inside, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Lisa." Alex's voice cracked, guilt flooding him in a rush. I didn't expect you to." "Don't lie to me again, Alex." She cut him off, her voice a quiet but firm accusation. She took a step forward, her eyes never leaving his. "I know what you're about to do. I know what you promised me, but I heard everything. You're not stopping, are you?" Alex felt his chest tighten. The walls closed in around him again, and for a moment, he felt trapped, not just by the heist, but by his own actions, his lies. He had told her he'd stop, but here she was, looking at him like she didn't know who he was anymore. "I told you, Lisa," his words came out hoarse. "This is the only way. I can't keep living like this." Tears welled in Lisa's eyes as she shook her head. "No, Alex, this is not you. This isn't the man I fell in love with. This is a stranger. a man who would destroy everything for a chance at more. Alex felt the sting of her words, but his mind raced, drowning out her pleas. He had made up his mind, and nothing she said could change it. "Lisa, please," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand. I need this. I can't be trapped here forever. I need something more. I can't keep living like this." Lisa took another step forward, but her eyes were pleading now, searching his face for any trace of the man she once knew. "Alex, please. I love you. I don't want to lose you." Alex's heart twisted, the weight of her words sinking deep into him. But the promise of escape, the allure of wealth, gnawed at him like an insatiable beast. "I'm sorry, Lisa, but this is happening," he said, his voice firm. Lisa's hands shook, her face pale with the anguish of her realization. "Then I'll stop you," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Alex watched her as she turned and walked out the door, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the empty room. He could feel her eyes on him as she left, but he couldn't turn around. He couldn't face her. The door slammed behind her, and in that moment, the weight of everything he had done, everything he was about to do, settled in. The lies, the betrayals, it was all too much. But there was no turning back. Not now. He turned back to Mike and John, who were standing silently, waiting. "We're good to go," Alex said, his voice colder now, a steely determination taking hold. "Let's finish this." But even as he spoke, a small, nagging doubt crept into his mind, a doubt he couldn't shake. He knew that once the heist was over, once the night was done, he would be left with nothing but the wreckage of his choices. And that was the scariest part of all. The air was heavy, as if the night itself could feel the tension rising in Alex's veins. Valentine's Day was only hours away, but for Alex, the anticipation was not for love. It was for something much darker. The plan was set. Tonight, they would execute a small rehearsal before the real heist. Alex stood in the shadows of the alleyway, the faint glow of a street lamp casting long, eerie shadows on the cracked pavement. He adjusted his hoodie, his mind buzzing with the adrenaline of the task ahead. This was their practice run, a test to see if they could pull it off without making any mistakes. But as the minutes dragged on, something gnawed at the pit of his stomach. It wasn't fear, it was something else. Something darker. "Everything's ready, man." Mike's voice broke through the silence, but Alex barely acknowledged it. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "We hit the store, grab the goods, and get out, no hesitation," Alex replied sharply, keeping his gaze fixed on the darkened storefront across the street. The small jewelry shop, tucked away in the corner of a quiet neighborhood, was the perfect place for a rehearsal. No one would expect a robbery here, and it would give them the confidence they needed for the real heist. John was already pacing back and forth, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "This is going to be easy."
Just like you said, Alex. No sweat.
But even as Alex nodded in agreement, his thoughts were elsewhere. His mind kept drifting back to Lisa. Her face, filled with worry, haunted him. He couldn't escape the memory of her last words to him. "I love you, Alex. Please don't do this." He had promised her it would be the last time, that he would back out, but the words felt hollow now, like a broken record playing on repeat. As they moved closer to the store, Alex tried to focus. He couldn't afford to let his guard down now. They had a job to do. No room for weakness, no time for regret. They crept through the alley and into the small jewelry shop. The door was locked, but it didn't take long for Alex to break it open with a crowbar. The sound of metal against metal echoed through the empty store, sending a shiver down his spine. This was it, the moment when they crossed the line. They moved quickly, ransacking the display cases, filling their bags with gold and jewels. Alex's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the room. The hum of fluorescent lights above was deafening in the silence, each movement sharp and urgent. But just as they were about to finish, the door swung open with a force that sent a jolt of panic through Alex. Lisa. Her presence was like a punch to the gut. She stood there, frozen in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock. The breath caught in Alex's throat. What was she doing here? Alex. Her voice trembled, filled with fear and desperation. I had to see you. Alex's heart raced. His hands shook as he glanced around the store. They had to get out now. The rehearsed plan, the smooth execution, it all began to crumble. Lisa wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to know. Lisa, what the hell are you doing? Alex snapped, his voice sharp, tinged with anger. His mind raced, trying to think of a way out of this mess. He couldn't afford any more distractions.
Not now.
I couldn't just sit at home. I knew you were planning this. I had to stop you. Her voice broke as she stepped forward, the pain in her eyes visible even in the dim light. Alex's hand gripped the edge of the display case, his knuckles white. The anger inside him surged, but underneath it was a deep sense of guilt, a gnawing feeling that he couldn't ignore. He had lied to her. He had promised to stop, to turn back, but here they were in the middle of the chaos. Leave, Alex growled, his words harsh. You shouldn't have come. Just leave, Lisa. It's too late for you to change anything. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't back down. Alex, please, you don't have to do this. There's still time to stop. You're better than this. Alex turned away, trying to block out her words. He couldn't let her stop him. He couldn't let anyone stop him now. This was his chance, his only chance to escape this life, to prove that he was something more than what he had been. It's already done, Lisa. Just go home. You won't understand. Lisa stepped closer, but her voice was soft, pleading. Please don't make me lose you. The words hit Alex like a physical blow. He stood frozen, torn between the woman he loved and the path he had already chosen. His heart ached, but the weight of his decisions dragged him further into the abyss. I'm sorry, Alex muttered, his voice barely audible. But I can't turn back now. With one last tearful glance, Lisa turned and fled, her footsteps echoing in the quiet store. Alex watched her leave, a storm of emotions swirling inside him. What had he just done? Mike and John didn't say a word. They knew better than to interfere now. But as they loaded the last of the jewels into their bags, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. The night was far from over, and the consequences of his actions were only just beginning to unfold. As Alex lay in his cramped bed, the moonlight slanted across the room, casting an eerie glow on the walls. The streets outside were quiet, as though the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to unfold. But Alex couldn't sleep. His mind was racing, consumed by the plan, the heist that had consumed him for weeks. He turned restlessly, his eyes flickering open as the shadows in the corner of the room began to shift. The darkness, heavy and suffocating, seemed to move closer, as though it were closing in on him. Then came the dream. He found himself standing in a pitch-black void, surrounded by an oppressive silence that echoed in his ears. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. A faceless figure, its features obscured by the darkness, but its presence overwhelming. It reached for him with outstretched arms, and Alex tried to run, but his feet were like lead, glued to the ground. The figure's cold, invisible hands brushed against him, sending a shiver through his entire body. He turned to flee, but every direction was the same, empty, vast, and unforgiving. Who are you? Alex shouted into the void, his voice trembling with fear. But there was no answer, only the faint sound of whispers, voices he couldn't understand, filling the air around him. He awoke with a start, his body drenched in sweat, his breath coming in frantic gasps. The room was still dark, the faint hum of the city outside the only sound. But the dream, the haunting presence, clung to him like a shadow. With trembling hands, he ran his fingers through his disheveled hair. He had to shake it off. He had to focus. The plan wasn't finished yet. There was still time. But deep down, a nagging feeling gnawed at him. Was it a warning? Was it a sign? He couldn't afford to think like that now. There was no time for hesitation. He quickly shoved the thought aside and forced himself to get up. The night was still young, and the heist was only hours away. The adrenaline, the excitement, it was all building up. He had to prepare. He had to follow through. But as he gathered his things, the image of that faceless figure lingered in the back of his mind. Its cold, empty presence haunting him. The air inside the dimly lit apartment felt heavy, like a storm was brewing just outside the walls. Alex sat on the edge of the worn-out couch, his mind spiraling. His hands fidgeted with the bracelet Lisa had given him, the one that he had shoved into his pocket and ignored. The small, fragile gift felt like a distant memory now, like something from another life, before all of this chaos began. Mike, sitting across from him, broke the silence. His voice was hesitant, filled with something Alex had never seen in him before. It wasn't just concern, it was fear. "Alex, you need to listen to me," Mike said, his words slow, careful. "This isn't the way. I know you think you're gonna make it out of this, but I've been where you are, man. My old man, he was like you, always thinking he could get away with it, always chasing that big score. And look where it got him, dead in prison. I don't want that for you. You're my friend, but you need to stop." Alex's gaze hardened as he stared at Mike. The words hit him like a slap across the face, but they didn't faze him. In fact, they only fueled the fire that burned inside him. He'd been hearing this kind of talk for weeks now, warnings, pleas, doubts. But none of it mattered. The plan was set. They had come too far. "You really think I'm gonna end up like your old man?" Alex sneered, standing up abruptly, the motion sending the chair crashing against the wall behind him. "You're weak, Mike. Always have been. You think I'm scared of prison? You think I'm scared of dying in some damn cell? You're the one who's scared, afraid to take a risk, afraid to live. I won't be like you. I'm not letting this life keep me down." Mike's expression faltered, his eyes briefly flicking away from Alex's, as if he were struggling with something inside. The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of Alex's words. "You don't get it, do you?" Mike muttered, almost to himself. "This isn't just about money. It's about losing yourself. And once you cross that line, Alex, there's no going back." Alex laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "I've already crossed that line, Mike. And I'm not looking back." Mike's shoulders slumped, the weight of the conversation settling in. His hands clenched into fists, the tension in the room palpable. John, who had been sitting quietly until now, suddenly spoke up, his voice dripping with an almost manic enthusiasm. "Stop being such a downer, Mike. Alex knows what he's doing. We all do. This is the chance to break free, the chance to make something of ourselves," John said, his words barely concealing the thrill of the heist to come. "Why should we listen to Mike, huh? He's just scared of the consequences." Alex turned to John, a smirk creeping onto his face.
Exactly.
"Mike's just too soft. But you and me, we get it. We know what's at stake." Mike shot them both a look of disbelief, his voice rising in frustration. "You're both idiots. You really think this is gonna fix anything? This is your chance to make it all go wrong." Alex, now visibly annoyed, turned his back on Mike. "Enough. I've made my choice, and nothing is going to change it. You can stay out of it if you want, but don't get in my way." Mike stood up, shaking his head. "Then I'm out," he said, his voice cold, his resolve clear. "But don't say I didn't warn you." As Mike walked toward the door, John's expression turned dark, his eyes narrowing as he turned to Alex. The cold air from the open door rushed in, but John's voice was a sharp whisper that sliced through the room. "You know, Alex," he began, his words deliberate, "Mike's right about one thing. You've already lost something, and you're not going to get it back. But you're going to be a lot more dangerous now. Trust me." Alex's eyes flicked to John, his unease flickering for just a moment before he pushed it aside. There was something in John's voice, something unsettling about the way he spoke. But Alex couldn't afford to dwell on it. His focus was fixed on the heist, on the riches that would soon be his. "Just stay out of my way," Alex muttered, his voice firm. John grinned, the smile that followed a little too wide, a little too empty.
"Oh, don't worry, Alex.
I'm right behind you." Mike slammed the door behind him, leaving Alex and John alone in the room. Alex sat back down, running his hands over his face, the weight of everything pressing on him. The warning from Mike, the words from John, they buzzed in his mind, lingering like an annoying fly that he couldn't shake off. But there was no going back now. The plan was in motion. Everything was set, and the clock was ticking. The night swallowed the city whole. The neon lights of Valentine's Day flickered in hues of pink and red, but to Alex Tran, they were the color of warning, of blood. The streets pulsed with life, couples laughing, exchanging gifts, making promises under the artificial glow of romance. But to Alex, the world felt muted, distant, as if he were standing behind a thick sheet of glass, watching a life that was no longer his. A cold wind swept through the alleyway where he stood, his breath coming out in quick, shallow bursts. His fingers curled into his jacket pockets, brushing against the cold steel of the gun he swore he would need. But deep down, he knew the truth. Tonight would be the turning point. There was no room for second thoughts now. No time for hesitation. A voice behind him cut through the silence like a blade. Alex. Lisa. He turned, his pulse spiking. There she was, standing just a few feet away, her eyes shimmering with something between heartbreak and desperation. She clutched the bracelet she had given him, the one he had tossed aside not long ago. The way she held it, tight and trembling, made his stomach twist. "Don't do this," she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of something far greater. "You still have a choice." Alex exhaled sharply, forcing himself to look away.
No, Lisa.
"I don't." Her footsteps echoed in the empty alley as she moved closer. "Yes, you do." Her voice cracked.
I know you, Alex.
"You're not a killer. You're not." "You don't know me anymore," he snapped, harsher than he intended. The moment the words left his mouth, he saw the pain flicker in her eyes, like a flame gasping for air. Lisa took a shaky breath, her fingers tightening around the bracelet. "I know you better than anyone," she whispered. "And I know this isn't who you are." Something inside Alex shifted, something small, fragile. But the moment of hesitation was cut short by a sudden noise. A gunshot. A scream. The sound tore through the night like a violent rip in reality. Lisa's eyes widened in horror. "Alex." He turned toward the street, adrenaline surging. The jewelry store, their target, was already bathed in chaos. The plan was spiraling out of control.
Red.
The color of love. The color of death. Another shot rang out. This time, closer. Lisa gasped, grabbing Alex's arm. "Run." But Alex couldn't move. His feet were frozen to the ground, his mind screaming at him, his heart thundering in his chest. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. And then, from the shadows, something moved. Something that shouldn't have been there. Lisa's grip tightened on his sleeve, her voice breaking into a whisper. "Alex, someone's watching us." Slowly, he turned. A figure stood at the end of the alley, draped in darkness, motionless. And then the figure took a step forward, and everything went cold. The night was unnervingly quiet, as if the entire city was holding its breath. Alex stood in the shadows, his pulse racing, the cold air biting at his skin. The streets, empty and still, seemed to mock him, reminding him that everything was about to change, for better or worse. Tonight, his life would either be marked by success or swallowed by failure. "Ready, man?" Mike's voice broke through the silence, pulling Alex out of his thoughts. Alex didn't answer immediately. He was too focused on the task at hand, replaying every step of the plan in his mind. The jewelry store loomed ahead, a place of wealth and opulence that had always felt just out of reach. But tonight, it would be his.
Tonight, he would seize what he deserved.
"Let's do this," Alex finally said, his voice low and steady, though a flicker of doubt stirred deep within him. There was no turning back now. They moved swiftly, shadows in the night, towards the store. The others, John and Mike, were already in position, ensuring everything was in place for the heist. Alex's thoughts kept flickering to Lisa, her pleading eyes from earlier still haunting him. But he had no time for that now. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his mask, the final layer of preparation. This was it. As they broke into the store, the sound of metal against metal echoed louder than it should have. Alex winced at the noise, but they couldn't afford to waste time. They had to act quickly. The store, pristine and quiet, was lined with glass display cases full of gleaming jewels, each one more beautiful than the last. Grab everything you can. Don't hold back, Alex hissed, the adrenaline making his voice sharp. He moved toward a display case filled with diamond rings, the weight of what they were about to do sinking in with each breath. Mike and John were busy filling their bags, their faces grim but focused. The tension in the room was thick, the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights above almost deafening. Alex's eyes darted around, scanning every corner, every reflection in the glass. But then, the door swung open. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and Alex's heart skipped a beat. He turned, expecting the worst, and his worst fear was confirmed. Standing in the doorway, wide-eyed and trembling, was Lisa. For a moment, everything stopped. The world, it seemed, paused. Lisa's face was pale, her eyes full of shock and pain, as if she had just walked into the middle of a nightmare she didn't understand. Alex's heart dropped into his stomach. "Alex," Lisa whispered, her voice shaky but filled with disbelief. "What are you doing?" Alex froze. The words caught in his throat. His first instinct was to yell at her, to send her away. But the guilt, the overwhelming shame, threatened to suffocate him. His mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation, but there was no justification for what he was doing. None that would make sense to her. "Lisa, please," Alex said, his voice cracking under the weight of the moment. "Get out of here.
Now."
But she didn't move. She couldn't. She just stood there, staring at him, tears welling in her eyes. "Alex, I knew something was wrong. I had to see you. I had to stop this." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. The desperation in her voice, the love she still had for him, despite everything, made his heart ache. But the darkness inside him, the ambition, was stronger. "Please, Lisa," Alex begged, but his voice was now cold, desperate. "This is the only way out. I can't keep living like this." Lisa shook her head, her body trembling. "No, Alex, you don't have to do this. This isn't you. I don't know who you are anymore, but this isn't you. Please stop." Alex's gaze hardened. He wanted to scream at her, to tell her that she didn't understand, that he couldn't stop now. But the words stuck in his throat. He turned away, feeling the weight of her gaze burning into him. "I have to do this, Lisa. I'm sorry, but this is happening." The sound of the police sirens broke through the moment, like a sharp, shrill scream from a distant nightmare. Alex's eyes widened as the reality of what had just happened hit him. Lisa's presence, her words, had caused a crack in his resolve, and the crack had widened too quickly. In that split second of hesitation, the police had arrived. "Shit," John muttered under his breath, his eyes darting toward the back exit. The sirens grew louder, and the sound of footsteps outside the store quickened. Alex's mind snapped back into focus. They needed to get out. They had no time to waste. But in his panic, his hand, shaking uncontrollably, reached for his gun.
"Alex, no."
Lisa shouted, but it was too late. The gunshot rang out, deafening and sharp. The sound seemed to echo forever in Alex's ears, the bang so loud it drowned out everything else. The chaos unfolded around him in a blur, police rushing in, sirens wailing, the panic of his friends. Alex stood frozen for a moment, the reality of what he had just done sinking in. A life was gone, and in that instant, he realized something darker. The life he had thought he was fighting for wasn't worth the cost. But it was too late. The sirens outside grew louder, and the door to the store was flung open by the officers. The group scattered in all directions, Alex's breath coming in short, ragged gasps. His heart pounded in his chest as he ran, his legs pushing him faster than he thought possible. But even as he ran, the weight of his decisions, the gunshot, the betrayal, the lies, hung heavy over him, gnawing at his soul. As Alex disappeared into the night, Lisa stood frozen, her heart shattering with the realization that the man she loved was gone, lost to the shadows of his own ambition. The morning after the heist was a cold one, with a hazy fog clinging to the streets, wrapping the city in an eerie silence. It felt as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable to happen. Mike and John had been arrested, their faces plastered across the news as the prime suspects in the failed robbery. But Alex was still out there, somewhere. Lisa sat in front of her TV, the images flashing before her eyes. The broken glass, the flashing sirens, the chaos she couldn't escape. She had watched the news reports over and over, unable to tear her eyes away from the screen. She had known something was off. She had known Alex was hiding something. But never, in her worst nightmares, did she think he would have gone this far. The report played again. A jewelry store heist turned deadly last night. The assailants, believed to be 3 men, shot and killed one store employee during the robbery. 2 suspects, Mike and John, have been arrested. The 3rd suspect, Alex Tran, remains on the run. Lisa felt her stomach tighten as she heard his name. The shock, the disbelief, it all hit her at once. Alex, the man she had loved, the man who had promised to change, was the one behind the chaos. The one who had pulled the trigger. She couldn't comprehend it. This wasn't the man she knew. Or was it? Her phone buzzed in her hand. She stared at the screen. It was a call from Alex's number. Her breath caught in her throat, and she answered without thinking. Alex. Her voice shook as she spoke his name, praying she was wrong, praying that the voice on the other end would be his, telling her it was all a mistake. But all she heard was the busy signal. She tried again. Same result. Her mind raced as the gravity of the situation hit her. Alex wasn't just running from the law, he was on the run from everything. From the life he had built, and, worse, from the man he had become. And Lisa wasn't sure if there was any way to reach him now. The moon hung high in the sky, its cold light filtering through the cracks of the abandoned warehouse. Inside, the silence was unnerving, broken only by the sound of Alex's uneven breathing. His body ached, his mind racing, as he crouched in the farthest corner of the dilapidated building. His clothes were soaked in sweat, and every inch of his skin seemed to crawl with the weight of his actions. Alex had become a ghost, one that the world no longer recognized. The noise of the outside world, the chatter, the hurried footsteps of the people he once knew, all felt like distant echoes. There was only darkness now, a suffocating void where even his thoughts felt like a threat to his sanity. He had been hiding here for days, alone with nothing but the flickering light of a single lamp to keep him company. The gnawing hunger in his stomach was nothing compared to the gnawing fear in his chest. The fear that what he had done could never be undone. The robbery, the murder, it all led to this. Alex gripped his head in his hands, trying to steady his thoughts, but the whispers wouldn't stop. They had started quietly at first, just the faintest of sounds. At first, he had thought they were just his mind playing tricks on him, the weight of his guilt making his senses betray him. But now they were louder. They were real. He could hear footsteps, slow, deliberate, dragging along the cold concrete floor. His heart hammered in his chest as he dared not look. Then the voice. "Why, Alex?" It was soft, almost a whisper, but the words seemed to vibrate in the air around him. Alex's pulse quickened, his breath shallow. He knew that voice. He recognized it. The voice of the man he had killed. The figure emerged from the darkness, a man, bloodied, his face twisted in a silent scream. His eyes, empty and accusing, locked onto Alex's. It was the jewelry store employee, the same man whose life Alex had ended in that frantic moment. His eyes were dull, lifeless, but there was an unmistakable sense of betrayal in them. "Why did you do it, Alex?" the figure repeated, its voice more insistent now. "Why?" Alex's hands trembled as he tried to push the image away, but it wouldn't vanish. The figure seemed to grow taller, closer, as if it were feeding off his fear. He shut his eyes tight, trying to force the apparition from his mind, but it clung to him like a shadow. I didn't want to do it, Alex whispered, his voice breaking. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I had to get out. I had to prove something. But not like this. Not like this. The ghost took a step forward, its cold breath brushing against Alex's face, as if it could reach into his very soul. You've crossed a line, it said softly. And there's no turning back now. Alex gasped, his breath catching in his throat. He scrambled backward, his feet stumbling over the debris on the floor. He needed to escape. He needed to run, to get away from the haunting presence. But the room felt smaller. The walls seemed to close in. His body trembled violently, his heart thudding painfully against his ribs. Please, Alex whispered, pleading with the ghost, with himself. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. I never meant for this. But the figure only stared at him, its silent eyes burning through him. Slowly, it faded into the shadows, its presence lingering long after it was gone. The silence returned, but it was worse now. It was heavier, filled with the weight of Alex's own guilt. The ghost wasn't the only thing haunting him now. He wiped his face, his palms shaking, sweat dripping down his forehead. Every thought that once seemed clear was now clouded with the terror of what he had done. His life was unraveling, and there was no escape. But somewhere, deep within, something stirred. A question. A deep, guttural question that Alex had been avoiding for far too long. Why me? He muttered aloud, his voice hoarse. Why did I do this? What makes me any different? The ghost's words echoed in his ears. You've crossed a line. He had crossed it. No matter how much he tried to deny it, no matter how far he ran, he couldn't escape the truth. It was inside him now, festering and growing, threatening to consume him. Alex's eyes searched the darkness, but he found no answers. Only the oppressive silence, the weight of his own choices. And then, in the quietest of whispers, a voice that wasn't the ghost's, but his own. Where do I go from here? The darkened alley was cold, the only sounds the distant hum of the city and the shuffling of Alex's boots as he moved cautiously through the shadows. His breath came in shallow gasps, his mind still reeling from the events of the past days. The weight of guilt, the horrifying image of the man he had killed, and the ghostly whispers that still haunted him made every step feel heavier than the last. Yet it wasn't just his conscience gnawing at him. It was the knowledge that betrayal was a poison coursing through his veins. It had been hours since he had sent John a desperate text, hoping for a sign of humanity, or some hint that his friends were still loyal. But the answer was not what he expected. Alex's hands shook as he pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling slightly from a mix of fear and fury. The screen lit up with a new message notification. The text was simple, but it hit him like a sledgehammer. We did what we had to do. They're after you, Alex. You're on your own now. John's words were cold, devoid of the camaraderie that had once bonded them. No apologies, no explanations, just the grim finality of a decision that had sealed Alex's fate. The betrayal stung, deeper than he expected. His heart pounded, and the phone felt like an anchor in his hand, pulling him into a dark abyss.
Mike, John,
his friends, his partners in crime. They had sold him out. Anger boiled inside Alex, surging like a tidal wave, consuming everything in its path. His fists clenched, the phone cracking under the pressure as he crushed it in his hand. He didn't need the phone to tell him what he already knew. He had been abandoned. The plans, the promises, the brotherhood. Everything had been a lie. In the distance, the faint sound of sirens grew louder.
police.
He didn't have much time. His mind raced, his chest tightening with every breath. He could almost hear Mike's voice now, the last few words they exchanged echoing in his head. Mike had tried to talk him out of the heist, tried to convince him to walk away. But it wasn't out of concern for Alex, it was fear. Fear of getting caught. Fear of everything unraveling. And now, that fear had turned into betrayal. Mike had sided with the police, giving them the information they needed to close in on Alex. Damn it, Alex muttered, his voice low and hoarse. He felt his pulse quicken as adrenaline surged through him. He couldn't just sit back and let them walk away with his life. They thought they could use him, throw him away like a used tool when it was convenient. But Alex wouldn't let them. He wasn't going to go down alone. Not after everything he had sacrificed. The city around him seemed to close in as he walked, the quiet hum of his anger filling the air. His mind raced through his options, but there was only one course of action now. One thing left for him to do. He needed answers. He needed to confront Mike and John. With every step, the weight of his rage grew heavier. The anger wasn't just for the betrayal. It was for everything he had lost. His life, his love, and his soul, all slipping through his fingers. The fire inside him burned hot, but it was no longer about survival or freedom. It was about revenge, and the path to redemption was long gone. As he reached the abandoned warehouse where he had been hiding, his eyes hardened. This wasn't just about making it out of this alive anymore. This was about making them pay. Alex clenched his jaw, his breath steady now as he readied himself for what he had to do. Mike and John would regret this. He would make sure of it. The betrayal had pushed him past the point of no return. Now, all that was left was the blood that would be spilled in the name of justice, his justice. The night outside felt colder than ever. The empty streets echoed with the distant hum of passing cars, their lights flickering like memories fading away. Inside the abandoned warehouse, the air was thick, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in on Alex Tran. His eyes darted to the shadows, haunted by his own thoughts, by the weight of what he had done, the blood he had spilled. He couldn't escape the suffocating guilt gnawing at him from within. His every move was a reminder of the choices he had made, and those choices were now chasing him like ghosts in the night. But despite the crushing despair, there was still one thing he was certain of. He couldn't stop. He couldn't turn back from the path he had chosen, no matter how much his soul screamed for mercy. Just then, the heavy door creaked open, a soft whisper of the wind cutting through the stale air. Alex's pulse quickened. His heart, already a drum of anxiety, skipped a beat as he caught sight of her, Lisa. She was standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear and determination. She had come here, to him. Even after everything he had done, even after the heist, the betrayal, the violence, she still loved him.
Or so she said.
Alex, she called, her voice shaking.
Please stop this.
You don't have to do this.
There's still time. Turn yourself in.
I'll be there for you. Alex's chest tightened. The anger that had simmered for weeks, the hunger for revenge, surged like a tidal wave, crashing against his insides. But beneath that fury, a sliver of guilt flickered. Lisa, his Lisa, standing there, offering him a chance for redemption. It was almost cruel. How could she still want him after everything? He turned away, pacing the room, his hands trembling at his sides. You think you can save me, Lisa? His voice was hoarse, dripping with bitterness. You don't understand. I'm too far gone. There's nothing left to save. But Lisa stepped closer, her voice breaking as she pleaded. I know you, Alex. I know you're not a monster. You don't have to keep running from yourself. Please come back to me. This isn't you. His fists clenched, his nails digging into his palms as the words tore at him.
She didn't understand.
She never had. The old Alex, the one she loved, was gone, replaced by someone desperate to prove he was more than the nothing he had always felt he was. This was the price, and there was no turning back. I'm sorry, Lisa, Alex whispered, his voice quiet now, full of regret. But it's too late for me. I don't want your pity. I don't want your forgiveness. Just leave me alone. But before Lisa could respond, the room grew colder. The shadows in the corners seemed to come alive, stretching longer, twisting into shapes that made Alex's skin crawl. His breath caught in his throat as the temperature dropped. Lisa froze as well, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. From the corner of the room, a figure stepped forward, its form slowly materializing from the darkness. It was the man Alex had killed, the jewelry store employee. His face was pale, eyes hollow. a vacant stare that pierced Alex's very soul. Alex staggered back, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. His mind raced, but the figure just stood there, silent, accusing. The blood on his hands burned like fire, and Alex couldn't escape the vision. The ghost of his crime had come for him. "Why did you do it, Alex?" the figure whispered, its voice barely audible but sharp enough to slice through the silence. Alex screamed, his voice breaking as his mind unraveled.
No. No.
This can't be real. He spun around, hands clutching at his head as if he could escape the vision. The figure stepped closer, its presence suffocating. "Alex," Lisa said softly, her voice shaking. "What's happening? What are you seeing?" But Alex couldn't hear her anymore. His vision blurred, the room spinning around him. The ghost's words echoed in his mind, repeating over and over again. "You've crossed a line. There's no going back now." He fell to his knees, his hands pressed to his ears, trying to block out the voice, the ghost, the guilt.
He couldn't take it.
His mind was breaking apart at the seams. The darkness that had consumed him had come to collect. Lisa stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest, but the terror on Alex's face only made her hesitate. She knew she needed to help him, but what could she do? He had already made his choices, and they had led him here, to this moment of insanity. "Alex, please," Lisa whispered, reaching out to him. "I love you. I can't lose you to this. Come back to me." But Alex was beyond reach now. His eyes were wide, filled with terror and madness. He opened his mouth, ready to scream, but the words got stuck in his throat. His body trembled violently, the ghost's presence overwhelming him. And then, in a flash of despair, Alex let out a guttural scream, one that seemed to tear apart his very soul. He covered his face with his hands, his body racked with sobs. "I didn't want this. I didn't want to hurt anyone, but I couldn't stop." Lisa recoiled, her eyes wide with fear. She turned and ran, her footsteps echoing as she fled from the nightmare unfolding before her. She couldn't save him.
Not now.
Not when the shadows had already claimed him. As she disappeared into the night, Alex's cries echoed through the warehouse, a hollow sound that would haunt him forever. The air inside Mike's apartment was thick with tension. Alex's blood boiled as he stood at the doorstep, gripping the cold steel of a knife. His mind was a chaotic whirlwind of rage, guilt, and confusion. The betrayal that cut deeper than anything else had left him a shell of the man he once was. Tonight, the ghosts of his choices would haunt him no more. He had made up his mind. Mike and John would pay for their deceit. Alex had been tracking them for days. The weight of their betrayal had consumed him, gnawing at him from within. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see the faces of those who had sold him out, the once trusted friends who had turned their backs on him for their own survival. The sound of laughter echoed from within the apartment, casual and carefree, as if nothing had changed. Alex felt his pulse quicken, his grip tightening on the knife. He took a deep breath, but there was no stopping what he had to do now. There was no turning back. He pushed the door open slowly, the creak of the hinges loud in the otherwise silent hallway. Inside, Mike and John were lounging on the couch, laughing, oblivious to the storm brewing just outside the door. "Hey, guys." Alex's voice was cold, cutting through the air like a blade. Mike's head snapped up, his expression changing from surprise to shock. "Alex," he gasped. "What the hell are you doing here?" John looked up too, a smirk playing on his lips, but it quickly faded as he saw the knife in Alex's hand. "What's going on, man?" John asked, his voice less confident now. Alex took a slow step forward, his eyes burning with fury. "You sold me out," he said, each word dripping with venom. "You gave me up to the cops. You were supposed to be my friends." Mike stood up, his hands trembling, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. "Alex, man, this isn't what it looks like." But Alex cut him off, the fury building inside him. "You think I don't know what it looks like?" Alex hissed. "I'm done with your lies. Both of you." Without warning, Alex lunged forward, the knife slicing through the air with precision. Mike stumbled back, his eyes wide with terror.
No. Alex.
Please, I have a family. I can't, he pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. Alex's gaze hardened. You should have thought about that before you betrayed me. With a swift movement, he drove the knife deep into Mike's side. Mike's breath caught in his throat as he fell to the floor, blood spilling from his wound. Please, Alex, don't, he gasped, his voice hoarse as he reached out weakly. But Alex didn't stop. His eyes were vacant, distant, as if the humanity within him had been extinguished. He turned toward John, who had frozen, his face a mask of fear. Before John could react, Alex stepped forward and delivered a swift blow, slashing across his throat. John collapsed to the floor with a gurgled scream, his life slipping away in an instant. The room was silent except for the ragged breathing of Mike, who was still clinging to life, and the faint gurgles of John's blood pooling on the floor. Alex stood over them, his chest heaving with the weight of his actions, but his expression was void of regret. There was no guilt, no remorse, only the cold emptiness of someone who had already lost everything. Mike looked up at him, his eyes pleading. Alex, please, I have a kid.
I didn't mean to. I was scared. Man, I didn't want to die.
Please. Alex's hand shook as he held the knife, but his voice remained cold. You should have thought about that before you turned me in. Mike's lips trembled as he gasped for air, his hand weakly reaching out.
I am sorry. I am sorry.
I never meant to, but Alex couldn't hear him anymore. The words were hollow, meaningless. The betrayal had been too much to bear, and now there was nothing left to save. Mike's cries were drowned out by the deafening silence that filled the room as Alex walked away, leaving his former friends to bleed out in the cold apartment. The night was cold, sharper than any night Alex had felt before. The dim streetlights of the quiet neighborhood cast long shadows on the cracked pavement. Alex staggered through the streets, his body battered and broken, his blood staining the concrete beneath him. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, his chest tight with the weight of his own mistakes. The bitter taste of betrayal still lingered in his mouth, but the pain in his body, the overwhelming ache of his wounds, made it impossible for him to think straight. His mind flickered, memories, fleeting images, all tumbling over each other, crashing like waves against the rocks. The robbery, the gunshot, the betrayal of his friends, his closest allies. But most of all, Lisa, the love he had destroyed. Lisa, he whispered, his breath shallow, his voice barely audible against the howling wind. Her face appeared before him, glowing in the shadowy corners of his mind, a haunting echo of the woman he had hurt. With each painful step, the vision of Lisa grew clearer. Her smile, her laughter, everything that had once felt like his world, like his anchor. Please don't leave me, Alex muttered, his words a desperate plea to a ghost he could never hold again. He stumbled, almost falling as his vision blurred with the approaching darkness. The jewelry store loomed ahead, its lights flickering like the last vestiges of hope Alex could reach for. The sign, lit up in bright neon red, Valentine's jewelry, it read. The irony wasn't lost on him. Valentine, the very name that had once symbolized love and connection, now felt like a mockery, a cruel reminder of the life he could never have. He collapsed on the cold pavement, the pain in his body a distant echo as his eyes fluttered closed. Through the haze, he saw her, Lisa, standing at the store's entrance, her face filled with warmth. Her laughter rang in his ears. It was so real, so vivid. It was almost as if she were there, reaching out to him, pulling him back from the abyss. Don't leave me, he gasped, his voice cracked, broken. He wanted to reach out to her, to apologize, to somehow make things right. But as his strength ebbed away, the vision of Lisa faded. With one last desperate breath, Alex whispered her name. Lisa? Before his body went limp, his final exhale a hollow surrender to the cold, empty night. The cold February night lingered, the dark city streets whispering secrets beneath the hum of distant traffic. Lisa stood alone, the weight of everything she had witnessed bearing down on her. The sight of Alex's lifeless body, covered by a white sheet, was an image she would never forget. She could barely catch her breath, her body stiff with the numbness of disbelief. Her hands, still trembling, grasped the broken bracelet she had made for Alex. It was a simple piece, nothing grand, but it was her heart, her hope, given to the man she thought she knew. She looked down at it, the familiar sight of the clasp now shattered, its meaning lost in the chaos that had torn their lives apart. How had it all come to this? Lisa's heart shattered as she stood there, trying to reconcile the Alex she loved with the man who had chosen a dark, destructive path. She reached for the bracelet's broken pieces, clutching them tightly as if holding onto the last remnants of what could have been. A chill breeze swept through the empty streets, and with it came an eerie sensation. Something in the air seemed to shift, like a presence was lingering just behind her. The feeling was familiar, though unwelcome. Slowly, she turned, the broken bracelet still in her hand. But the streets were empty. No Alex, no shadow of the past. Only the quiet, darkened road stretched before her, as though the city itself had swallowed his presence. For a split second, she thought she saw him, his silhouette barely visible, standing in the distance, but when she blinked, the figure was gone. Lisa shook her head, feeling a wave of dizziness flood over her. No, she whispered to herself, stepping backward, unsure whether she was seeing things or if the grief had finally driven her mad. But in that brief moment, she knew something. Someone was still there, even if it was just an echo, a memory haunting her from the shadows. The wind howled as she slowly turned away from the scene. She felt the weight of everything she had lost, the love, the hope, the man who had been her everything and nothing at once. The city was silent, but in that silence, there was something more, a presence, an unspoken truth. Lisa walked, the sound of her footsteps barely audible against the still night air. Her heart was heavy with the truth of what had transpired. Alex was gone, and with him, any chance of redemption or reconciliation. What had driven him to this fate? The weight of his choices hung around her, like a cloak of shadows that she couldn't shake off. As Lisa reached the end of the street, she glanced back one last time, the pieces of the bracelet still clutched tightly in her hand. The distant echoes of sirens faded, but the ghost of Alex's presence lingered, just beyond reach. And though she couldn't see him, she could feel him, a part of him still tied to the night, to the choices that had brought them to this moment. And then, with a final breath, the shadow was gone. Lisa stepped into the night, the wind tugging at her clothes, her heart heavy with the weight of love lost, and the fragile hope that somehow, someday, things could have been different. But as she disappeared into the quiet darkness, she knew the path she had once shared with Alex was now just a story, a tragic tale left behind, fading into the cold, empty night. As the screen darkened, the wind howled through the desolate streets, carrying the echoes of a love that could never be reclaimed.